since the beginning, there has been this idea that you have to go ahead and attack um, and, let's say, smear the people who have been trying to find out what really happened. Okay, and I guess Hugh Ainsworth would be one really good example, right? Who worked down there in Dallas from the very beginning, and he's basically said this, that that's his job, you know, to go ahead and make sure that the Warren Commission is the official story. All right, people like this, people like Priscilla Johnson, all right, and they've been joined later on, okay, um, by people like Gus Russo and Dale Meyer. It's a little different in those cases because they actually used to be critics at one time, and now they've actually joined the other side. All right, um, and Robert Stone, I guess, would be the latest. He actually had these guys on, Priscilla Johnson and Hugh Ainsworth, and they've always been there to muddy the waters, to make things, to make things more confusing, to be there and pile on to the official story, and to make it harder, for the public, okay, to get a kind of unified view. All right, and I think basically that's what they're there for. They're basically there, to be sure that there's a strong opposition and to drown out the critics. And whenever the networks do a special, or in this case it was actually PBS, the idea is to trot out one of these so-called authorities, which is the last word that I would apply to them, okay? Because they're not authorities. They're basically, their job, is to basically confuse things and to maintain the verdict of the Warren Commission. There's there's a lot more money, let's put it that way, than what they do than what I do. Okay.
Talk about that a little bit.
Well, even though Hugh Ainsworth has, been pretty much exposed, I did that in my first book, okay, where he wrote that telegram, basically saying in advance of his Newsweek story, that it was to, I think that was to the FBI and the White House at that time, alerting them in advance to, his attack upon Garrison, in Newsweek. I mean, you know, the guy's been exposed but he's never been hard up for a job. He always manages to land on his feet, no matter, what terrible garbage he puts out there. All right. So, there's always, people with their connections, as long as somebody's willing to doing something like that, there's always people who will go ahead, and look out for them, go ahead and find a way that they're going to be employed. And by the way, I gotta say, a CIA guy actually showed me how that worked once. All right, he actually showed me this letter of reference that one of his bosses had written for this kid. Okay, who basically said, "Look, I'll write what you guys want. Okay, but just get me a job somewhere." And so he showed me this reference letter that one of these CIA guys had written for this kid. He knew somebody at this, I think it was an East Coast newspaper, and got the guy a job. And that's the way the system works. Of course, I shouldn't just say it's not just the CIA. I mean, the way the whole system is set up, the Eastern establishment, these forces that want to go ahead and propagate the company line will always pay more. There's always more money in it than trying to tell the truth. Okay, that's just the way it works.
One of the things in the film, for instance, and you hear it all the time, is that researchers are in it for the money.
What money? Besides Oliver, who's ever made any money, propagating a conspiracy? I mean, did Harold Weisberg ever move to New York and Park Avenue? I mean, that guy spent 40 years of his life, all right, on that farm, all right, and basically, well, towards the end, he was mimeographing his own manuscripts. He even had a hard time getting his books published, all right. So, what money is there in it? Uh, there's very, very few books in the field at all, that anybody can say made a lot of money. And the vast majority of them, I believe, if you take it by the amount of books published, have been on the other side. I mean, there's been very few books written by the critics. I mean, Mark Lane's book, Rush to Judgment. All right. David Lifton's book, Best Evidence. Maybe a handful of others. That's been about it. Now, if you add up how many books have been written, I think the last figure is 900 that I saw. Okay, just figure it out. I mean, if you want to make money, it's the last thing you want to do. All right, because the odds are stacked against you about as bad as the lottery. You know, of going ahead and making any money off this field. It's just not there. All right, if you want to make money, you do what Gerald Posner did. All right, and you write a whitewash book. Okay, and that's where you get on TV, etc. And that's the way the system works.
What about Bugliosi?
Well, he's a special case. Vince is actually a pretty decent guy, and he actually did some good work on the RFK case. But in this particular case, I think what happened with this trial of Lee Harvey Oswald in London, okay, I actually think that he thought that he actually achieved something, okay, all right, with that trial. All right, if you watch the trial, though, it's pretty evident to anybody except Vince that the reason he won that case was not because he did such a great job. It's just Jerry Spence just did a bad job. Okay, here this guy has his dream of a lifetime of any Warren Commission critic actually getting Ruth Paine on the stand. Okay, and having being able to ask her any question you want. All right, and his cross-examination of her, I thought, was pretty pathetic. All right, it's pretty obvious that he didn't do his homework. I mean, you can imagine some attorney who was really prepared and really knew the case. Okay, what they could have done with that opportunity, But Spence blew it. It didn't look like he had done any work at all, or very little. So that's the reason that thing came out the way it did. Then Bugliosi went ahead and submitted his manuscript, but then it was delayed and delayed and delayed, and then Stone's movie came out, and the ARB came out, etc. All right, and so it got bigger and bigger and bigger. All right, and I think it's 1,600 pages, and then 900 pages of supplementary notes. And all it is, I don't care what Vince says he did. It's basically nothing but a regurgitation of what has come before. I find very, very little new that's in that book. It's also very much padded, because a lot of this stuff doesn't have to do anything with the Kennedy case. There's a lot about JFK's life. There's a history of the mafia, okay, in there. So, it's basically, I think, just a gargantuan molehill, okay? Inflated rubber doll. That's basically what it is, Well, Gary Mack started as a pretty strong Warren Commission critic down there in Dallas, and he was part of that, the men who killed Kennedy, back there. I think that was in 1988. Then, as the years went by, he kind of became neutral. Today, I actually think he's a little bit in favor of the Warren Commission because he got that job at the 6th floor, and if you go to the 6th floor, it's pretty clear that they favor, the Oswald as lone assassin, point of view. All right, so he's one of these guys who traveled from one side, migrated from one side to the other. Well, I think one of the very high points, of course, was from about 1965 to about 1967, and I think that began with Vincent Slandria's wonderful essay in Liberation magazine, where he actually became the first guy to actually trace the path of the single bullet. Okay, very very remarkable essay, even to this day. All right. Then, of course, in 1966, you had Edward Epstein's book Inquest, followed by 3 very important books in 1967. Rush to Judgment, 6 Seconds in Dallas, and Accessories After the Fact. Those are 3 milestone books in the case, right? Then the whole Garrison thing took over, all right, for a period of about 4 or 5 years, okay, and it came into kind of after Shaw's acquittal and Garrison's inability to get him convicted for perjury. The case went into a kind of nadir until what revived it was the church committee hearings, right? And once people found out about all the secret things the CIA and the FBI were doing, including this alliance with the mafia to kill Castro, that's what kind of revived interest in the Kennedy assassination, all right? And the Zapruder film got shown that same year, and that, of course, created a real powerful blast to create the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which probably the first phase of the House Select Committee under Richard Sprague was as close as a Kennedy assassination ever got to a real actual murder investigation. And I think once Sprague made it clear that that's what he was going to do, the powers that be descended on him and made sure they were going to get rid of this guy, just so we get rid of Garrison. Okay? And so Sprague was basically sent on a bus out of town, right? And they brought in Robert Blakey, who basically did a nice controlled operation, you know, a limited hangout kind of a thing. And there were a couple books that came out after the House Select Committee that were quite good, you know, that increased interest in the case, like Henry Hurt's Reasonable Doubt and Anthony Summers' book Conspiracy. Okay, and then it kind of flattened out until Oliver Stone's movie based upon Jim Garrison's book. Okay, I think Garrison's book was 1988, and then Stone decided to adapt it into a film in 1991, and that created a hurricane, you know, likes of which I've never seen before. All right, which, you know, both sides just going at it for about a solid year. You know, um, all these new books came out, and all these new books, classics, were reissued. You went to these bookstores, and they said we can't get enough of these books. They sell out a week after we get them in here. You know, and that stayed for about a year, and then came the Assassinations Record and Review Board. All right, and that led to a lot of really, really good information. In fact, there's one fantastic book that came out a few years ago, Breach of Trust, which, in my opinion, is the best study of the Warren Commission ever written. All right, and so now we just wait for the results of this, of people going to these archives, these newly declassified archives, and hopefully we'll get some really better literature, you know, with these new pages. Although, you know, I'm really kind of discouraged by that because there's been quite a few bad books that have been written since 1998 also. Like, for example, this Ultimate Sacrifice book, you know, it's really surprising, uh, you know, and I was disappointed in the Mellon book, Farewell to Justice, which I think could have been much better, you know. And so hopefully we'll get some better books written based on these, you know, based on these newly declassified. But that's basically been, it's been a kind of, you take a look at it, it's like a roller coaster, you know, you know, beginning, you know, you go up to Garrison, then you go down, you go up to the Church Committee, House Select Committee, then you go down, you go up to JFK, then you go down, you go to the IRB, then you go back down. Okay, that's the way it's basically been.
And can you tell me where we are now?
Well, I think now, you know, we're basically waiting, I think, for a really terrific overall book, you know, that will really basically put everything together. That's what I hope to see somebody do. Although it's going to be very difficult, you know, because as Harold Weisberg said, this case is so complex. You know, he doubted very much any one person, you know, could actually deal with all the whole thing, you know. But something interesting though is that there's been a lot more interest in the RFK case of late. That's been one of the most interesting things. I think it's really good and healthy. Okay. But I think the JFK case has predominated so much, over the other cases. I don't know if that's good because then people tend to see that in a vacuum. Okay,
Can you get that quote again? People tend to see that in the vacuum.
they tend to see the JFK case in a vacuum, which is not the way I think you should see it. That's the way I saw it, by the way, when I started. All right, I don't see it in a vacuum anymore. I see them as being connected. And that's one reason we did our book the way we did, to connect them all together, to show that this was all meant to basically spell the end of an era. Okay, the great excitement of the 1960s. You know, of hopes and idealism, where you had these four great leaders miraculously all at one time. Amazing. You know, I mean, try and compare that to what we got now. Okay, you had these four great people all at one time. All working with each other. And it really gave the whole idea that somehow, hey, we're really going to change this country now. We're really going to live up to what we're supposed to be doing, etc. And then one by one, under these very suspicious circumstances, within the space of 5 years, that's 5 years, to kill all four of these guys within the space of 5 years, under all those really ridiculous circumstances, and nobody says, I think the only guy who ever said anything about it in public was Truman Capote. One night when he was on the Tonight Show, okay, I'll never forget that. And I think Melanson mentions it in his book on RFK. Truman Capote came on one night. I think it was after the RFK assassination. All right, and he said something like, "John, do you keep a diary?" I think Garth goes, "No," because I'm a writer and I don't keep a diary. Why do all these guys keep diaries? Okay. Oswald, okay, Sirhan, they all keep diaries, okay, although none of them is a writer or anything like that. He went from there and he said, isn't it really weird how they have these loner personae, okay, who no matter how lonely they are, they have enough time to write in their diaries certain things that they're going to do, okay, and that's the only time, by the way, that I've ever seen anybody in public actually connect all those cases together. All right. So it's very, very. I'll never forget it. It was so compelling. The way he tried to put them all together because nobody ever done it before. And that, like I said, that was in '68 that he did that. Yeah. Yeah. It was. It was really interesting to see how quickly the resistance organized. Against that film. It actually was before the film ever even got released. You know, and so Garrison had been such a controversial figure, okay, that I kind of expected that to happen. Although, even though I was even surprised at how harsh the reaction really was before the film even got released, but it did a lot of good in that it introduced a lot of people to a lot of the controversies of this case and actually presented some of the critical arguments, in a really kind of open and unshielded kind of a way. And it actually presented Garrison in a sympathetic light. For about one solid year, it dominated the publicity. You know,
Well, as a member of the research community dedicates so much of your life to it, for a director like Oliver Stone, get major Hollywood backing to make a film on that. I mean, what was that like for the community? It must have been huge.
well, it was it was really it was really an interesting time because, like I said, a lot of new people came into it, and it revivified the interest in the case. You know, but you'd be surprised at how many people inside the community didn't like it because Garrison had become such a polarizing figure. So people like Paul Hogue, okay, who began writing against the film even before the film came out, all right, etc. And there were other people like Harry Livingstone who didn't care much for Garrison either. But what it did is, I think it really brought in a whole lot of new people like for example, Gary Aguilar, okay, Doug DeSalis, myself, okay, it brought in a whole lot of new people, into the field, and it kind of brought in a whole different angle, you know, to the discussion and to the research. David Mantic, a very bright scientist and medical doctor who's made a lot of really terrific discoveries in the JFK case. So it brought in this whole new generation of, of newer thinking and, analysis into the JFK case, which I think has really, really helped. David Mantic and Gary Aguilar have taken the medical evidence to a plateau that it's never been before, in my opinion. I mean, they've really done some remarkable work.
So here we are, 45 years later. Can you tell me why bother? Devil's advocate, why bother?
Well, because I think that the best argument for that is that.
Can you kind of put my question in your answer?
Okay, all right, fine, all right. I think the reason it still matters today, and I think the reason that there's still people working in the field, is because that was really a kind of time where the whole underside of the American political system was first exposed. You know, because before Kennedy, you basically had Eisenhower. Eisenhower was like your Uncle Willie. Okay, like he's just a guy who came over on Sundays, etc. Just the guy who take care of everything. With Kennedy was exploring these new dimensions. Okay, he had these things going on in Vietnam. Was going to withdraw from Vietnam. The detente with Castro. Okay, the friendship with Khrushchev. All right, the melting down of the Cold War, the war on poverty, the fight to get civil rights, and suddenly he's snuffed out in an instant. It's all over. Okay, and so then finally, what you see that the forces that were arrayed against him, when you pick up that rock and you start investigating this case, all right, and so I think as the years have gone by, the rock has been rolled further and further, and you see more of this underside, of the American political system that was never supposed to be exposed. And I think one way to think about this is that if they were willing to undergo this kind of exposure to get rid of this guy, that's how important it was to get rid of this guy. All right? You know, like Cyril Weck said, they were looking at 8 years of this guy, plus another 8 years after him with his brother. All right? And they just basically came to the conclusion, we're never going to be able to get back to where we were when these two guys are done. All right? And so they basically took this calculated risk. All right? We're going to go ahead and get rid of him. And if we have to expose a lot of our covert operations, a lot of the ways we work, it's going to be worth it, because if we put up with the 16 years, we're not going to be anywhere at all. We might not even be here then. All right? And so that's what was at stake here. And you see the way the system really operates. For the first time, you actually saw these forces that were never supposed to be seen. You saw these things like the covert operations of the CIA. You saw these things like the terrible things that the FBI did. Like spying on Americans and surveillance of people's sex lives. And all these. Okay, and you saw the compromised. Well, I won't say compromised. The complete corruption of the media. Okay, by the arms of the government. That was the first time you saw those things. Okay, and far from lessening, as the time has gone on, these things have been more and more exposed. Like I was telling you, it really breaks me up when I hear about the liberal blogosphere. These guys are so self-congratulatory at what they've done. They're this counterweight to the mainstream media. Okay, it's like these new thing that they discovered. They're these rebels, okay, against the powers that be. Well, we've been doing this for quite a long time before those guys ever got on the scene. Okay, they've been getting all the glory, okay, and the rewards, while we still keep on doing it, and we basically paved the way for them. All right, so I see it as we're the guys who basically made their kind of stance amenable to the public. This whole, anti-establishment kind of thing. Well, we've been doing it for a heck of a long time, a heck of a lot longer than they have done. So I think that's the reason that um, that's why it's important today, because somebody has to say that something really went wrong with this country in 1963. Something really went wrong. Okay, and if we don't ever acknowledge it, it's never going to get any better. Okay, the worst thing you do about a serious problem is ignore it. Okay, and so that's why I think there's still a lot of people still working in it.
What are the implications of the case on today?
Well, I think one thing is this. One thing we talked about in the book, the assassination, the way that thing affected the Democratic Party, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. In my opinion, the Democratic Party has never been the same. You basically had, after Kennedy, um, you really didn't have much of anything. If you really want to get harsh about it, and then you eventually had the complete eclipse of the Democratic Party when they created this Democratic Leadership Council, which in my view is just a capitulation to the Republicans. It's basically Democratic Party light, or Republican light, or whatever you want to call it. All right, and it's never really actually been quite what it was. I mean, just take a look at the presidential elections and who they've offered up there. There's been nobody like JFK. Nobody even came close. Not even close. Not even to his brother. And hopefully now it's kind of reviving itself. I hope and I believe. All right. But that's really what happened. For sort of like the legend in the Bible, 40 years out in the desert. Okay, that's why I thought it was interesting that when Ted Kennedy decided to endorse somebody, he decided to do it with Barack Obama, and he did it at American University, which was the place where JFK did his famous, Pax Americana speech back there, I think, in July of 1963. I think that was a symbolism of that. I think that's what Ted Kennedy was trying to say there, you know. So that's why, it's important to the political scene today. For anybody who understood that piece of symbolism, I thought it was really interesting that they had those thousands of students sleeping out on the grass the night before. They had so many journalists that they were actually paying money to get credentials to get in. You know, so I think that was a pretty kind of neat, significant moment that kind of summarized. You know, I mean, let's put it this way: I know Ted Kennedy knew what he was doing. Okay, by putting it at that scene. You know.
How do you feel about the state of things now? Feel about the future of the
You mean
case?
of the case of the way I feel about it? I don't know. I think it's going to be more difficult to keep that percentage we have high because I think the networks and the media is kind of paradoxical. They've even become worse now, I think, than they were before. I mean, the Jennings special was really horrible. I mean, it was, in some ways, it was even worse than the CBS special of 1967. All right, it was just a terrible, terrible piece of work in 2003. And then this Robert Stone's film, this Oswald's Ghost. And remember, this is PBS. This isn't even the networks. You know, is pretty awful in its own. The way it ignored. See, I think that's been the most disappointing thing is the way these two films just basically ignored, all the new stuff that's come out of the archives. In fact, that's what I think their objective was. Their objective was not to publicize the new discoveries that have come out of the archives. Okay, for very good reason, because it basically destroys the Warren Commission case. Even more than it's been destroyed before. You know, so it's been kind of disappointing in that because it's a lot of people thought that once the guys at the networks passed away, the David Sarnoffs and the Bill Paleys, etc. That might be the time that there would be an opening to actually get some truth, or some fairness in the JFK case. It hasn't proved to be the case at all. It's very odd. In some ways, I don't quite understand it. But it hasn't been the case at all. It's been very disappointing from that, from that kind of point of view. It's almost like, the mainstream media is the mainstream media, and it has a collective memory. And we were made fools out of back then, and we don't want to revisit it. We don't want to go back and admit that we fell for a cover story. All right? Because if we do, we're going to lose our credibility. The little credibility we have left in this day and age. Okay, so it's been very kind of disheartening to watch this thing, unfold with the media.
What's this? Can you tell me what the state of the research community is right now?
What do you mean?
Well, are there divisions? Are you unified?
Well, okay. After the ARB closed its doors, the research community, there were several journals that one by one decided not to publish anymore, but they basically have gone online. Okay, so and we're one of them. All right, there's JFK Lancer, Walt Brown has a website, so there's basically three of them, and they keep on publishing. Lancer actually publishes books. Okay, Walt Brown keeps on working on this research compendium that he's working on, and we go ahead and keep on publishing articles and reviews, of the new work that's come out. So that's basically the way that the new work comes out and is reviewed and is discussed. And there's conferences that come around. I think there's going to be two in Dallas, this fall. And and that's basically the way the state of it is today. That's I guess it'd be really nice if somebody did something like JFK with the RFK case. That would be a real terrific tornado, to attach to. That would be a really interesting thing to do. But I think besides, if we don't have that or another terrific headline grabbing book, I think it's going to be at this kind of stasis, for a while. And then the problem is that the really good books like Breach of Trust don't get any publicity because they are what they are. They're telling the truth about the Warren Commission, and he gets a university publisher. He doesn't get a blitz campaign. He doesn't get Katie Couric interviewing him. He doesn't get even PBS or anything like that. And his book basically is confined, to the small community of activists and the people who are interested, in the JFK case, even though it's a fantastic book. But like I said, that's the way that the deck is stacked. COPA was originally established back, and I was one of the people who did it, back in I think 1993, 1994. And that was supposed to be an umbrella group that contained everyone. All right. And it survived in that form for, I think, 4 or 5 years. And it was actually pretty effective. All right. Basically, in around 1998, 1999, its supporters kind of pulled away. There was Cyril Weft and Gary Aguilar and myself, all right, and it basically, John Judge basically runs it now. It's almost, I'd say, a one-man operation. Now, JFK Lancer is a different organization. They arose around Mary Farrell, okay, back there in the mid 90s, all right, and they're basically led by Larry Hancock and Deborah Conway, okay, and at that time they were kind of smaller organization with and they established a journal also, the Assassination Chronicles, all right, and they're the other surviving group, okay, that both has an online system and also sponsors these conferences. You know, why they compete against each other and why they don't get together and put one big conference on, I don't understand it. Like I said, I kind of dropped out of that, in the late 90s, and so I haven't been involved in the politics of it. All right, I don't know. I'm kind of mystified by it also, you know. So I think it would be better, but that's the way it seems to be for now. Yeah. And then Cyril Wecht puts on. He put one on in 2003, and he's probably going to put another one on Duquesne this year, and that should be really good. That should be very good. Uh, the one he put on in 2003 was quite good, and I expect this one to be just as good.
Is there anything you'd like to say that I haven't asked you about?
Well, what I think you should ask me is what were some of the really important things that came out of the ARB? Some of the adventure. Okay. See, and some of the really, really, I think, important discoveries that have come out of these declassified files that the ARB spent 4 years declassifying. I think they center around the ballistics evidence, okay, number one, the medical evidence, and Oswald, all right? I think one of the really interesting things is the way that it turned out that Gerald Ford rewrote the Warren Commission report, all right? That he actually changed the text in the report to move the wound in JFK's back from a position below his neck into his back to a position at the base of his neck, all right? Which is very significant for the simple reason that if you raise the entrance wound to the neck, you of course make the single bullet theory more plausible because entering at a higher trajectory, then it has a possibility of going through the base of his throat in the front and hitting Connolly. Because if it comes into the downward trajectory in his back, how could it possibly come out the base of his neck? So that little bit of rewrite that Gerald Ford took part in shows you, of course, that these guys were very conscious of the problems they were having, with the trajectory of this magic bullet. And they had to actually change the text of the report before it got printed because they've kind of figured, wait a minute, somebody's going to read this and say, how does a bullet coming into the downward angle at a guy's back exit the base of his throat? All right. So that was one of the really interesting discoveries that I believe came out. Another interesting discovery was that the FBI, it appears, cooperated in a little bit of legerdemain about whether or not the two witnesses who are given credit for discovering the magic bullet on the stretcher at Parkland Hospital ever really discovered that particular bullet. All right, because it turns out that Josiah Thompson and Gary Aguilar visited Bardwell Odom, the FBI agent who was supposed to have actually shown the bullet, to Daryl Tomlinson and O.P. Wright and said, is this the bullet that you guys discovered that day, on the stretcher? And supposedly this happened and they identified it. Well, it turns out that when they went down to visit Bardwell Odom, who happened to still be around at that time, he said, no, I don't recall ever doing that. So now here you have this complete fraud, because if these guys didn't identify that bullet, okay, and O.P. Wright actually said it was a different bullet because he told Thompson in his book that the bullet that he found wasn't even shaped that way, okay, and they never identified it earlier or later. All right, then obviously CE399 looks more and more like it was planted, okay, you know, by somebody else. And Jack Ruby, according to two witnesses, was at Parkland Hospital at that particular time. Right? Another thing that I think is really important is that in the medical evidence, it turns out that there was always this controversy about whether or not there was a blown out back of the skull in JFK's head. Right? And in the Warren Commission report, it basically says that there wasn't, even because Jacqueline Kennedy's testimony was actually not revealed about the hole she saw in the back of her husband's head, right? And then when the House Select Committee got it, it recognized this split between what they said was the Parkland Hospital doctors and the Bethesda Hospital doctors. And they say the people of Parkland saw it, but the people of Bethesda didn't see it, and the people of Bethesda actually worked on the body for a much longer period of time. So we're going to take precedence over them. Well, in the declassified files, it turns out that both groups of medical people saw this hole in the back of JFK's skull, right? And there's like 45 affidavits that was collected. People saw them from Parkland all the way to the funeral parlor, okay, that said there's this blown out back of the skull. Okay, now, why that's important, of course, is because entrance wounds, most of the time, okay, at a medium or high speed velocity rifle, like this is supposed to have been, okay, when they come in, they leave kind of smaller, neater holes as they enter, okay, and then as they exit, because of all the mass they accumulate coming through the skull, the tissue and bones, they leave this kind of jagged, bigger hole, okay, so if there is no big hole coming out the front of JFK's skull, but there is this big hole in the back of his head. Okay, well, that would seem to indicate that the bullet didn't come from behind. The bullet came in from the front. Okay, so this is another really, really big discovery that the ARB has made possible. And one more that I'll mention is that the Mexico City trip, when Oswald returned from Russia, okay, he went and there was a flash issued by the FBI. Okay, a flash means watch out for this guy. He looks like he's a communist sympathizer, and he might be up to no good. Right? Oswald takes this very strange trip to Mexico City. And by the way, I should say there's a debate about whether he actually went or not. Okay, but for sake of argument,
to a specific document or release that was.
Yes. All right. It turns out that after he leaves Mexico City on about October the 9th, somebody removed the flash from Oswald's file in the FBI, which meant, of course, that the FBI wouldn't be looking around for him anymore, which meant when the Secret Service was planning the Dallas trip, he would be off their security index. The FBI did not pass his name on to the Secret Service. So that is how Oswald got into Dealey Plaza that day. Because if his name would have been on the flash, the Secret Service would have surveilled him. Okay? They would have known exactly where he was. And they would have tried to either make sure he was not there that day, or they were watching him when he was there. Okay? So this is very interesting that somebody in the FBI removed the flash report on Oswald's name, which allows him to go ahead, of course, and be on the motorcade route that day. So those are just four things that I threw out there. We can sit here, I can go on for 3 hours. Okay, all the great things that the ARB has released, but the fact that hardly anybody knows about any of them tells you the media blackout that's occurred. Because this is a big problem, of course, that the research community has. And this, of course, is why we had to do probe, because Peter Jennings was not going to tell you this stuff. Yeah. That's a good wrap up, isn't it?
Good.
Okay.
Good. you have any?
No, you have to get his. You have to do the top for me. So get his bio and his
Okay.
references.
Okay. Yeah. Can you do the top of the interview again? Um, my name is. This is what I do.
Okay. Um, my name's Jim DiEugenio. I'm an author of a couple of books, Destiny Betrayed and The Assassinations. I published and co-edited Probe Magazine for about 7 years, till about the year 2000. I have a degree in history, and so I teach government and economics, right, to high school seniors, and I've been doing that for quite a long time in my actual day job.
What is Probe Magazine?
Can you tell me what program
Okay,
is?
Probe Magazine was a journal that arose around 1993 as a result of the renewed interest in the JFK case, through the combination of Oliver Stone's film and the creation of the ARB. And so, what we tried to do there is to go ahead and publish a lot of the new documents, the new progress, and the hearings that were taking place at that time. About the search for all the documents that were the government not let go of prior to Stone's film, because at the end of Stone's film, you see this card that says the files of the House Select Committee assassinations have been have been censored until the year 2029. They've been classified till the year 2029. All right, and so that kind of created a huge interest. Well, if Oswald did it, why can't they let these files be released? All right, and so then began the hearings and the creation of the Assassinations Record Review Board. We knew that no matter what great stuff came out of the Assassinations Record Review Board, the mainstream media wasn't going to cover it. All right, so we went ahead and decided, well, we'll go ahead and cover it, and so that's what Probe Magazine was about.
How big did Probe get subscribers?
Well, Probe, I'd say that between the subscriptions and the libraries and the newsstand copies, we probably got up to maybe like 600, and you always translate that to a what they call a read through. Okay, which means that somebody buys the magazine, somebody comes over and reads the magazine. You translate that by a factor of about 5 in the industry. So at our pinnacle, we were probably reaching about 2,500 people. Okay, but I'll tell you this though, the impact it had was really something, because we would get some of the articles we would get these big magazines in New York writing us and saying that they wanted a copy of this particular issue. Okay, because they'd heard about it from somebody, they heard about it, through some other source. It's really kind of remarkable. What had happened. Like the New York Review of Books, I think, wrote us. There's another magazine. I can't recall the name of it. They wanted a copy of one of the articles that we did. All right. Our subscribers would actually go ahead and talk to the people to big magazines, and they would say, look, you're dead wrong on this. Take a look at this thing I'm going to send you, and it would actually impact some of the coverage. Like that particular instance I'm thinking of now is Newsweek magazine. Okay, when Seymour Hersh's book came out, we did an article about that, and one of our subscribers went ahead and called Evan Thomas at Newsweek, and Evan Thomas came out with a kind of negative review of the book, thanks to the guy on Pro Magazine subscriber list who called him. So that's the kind of impact that it had. Way beyond its rather small circulation.